It's about finding your little corner of the internet to hang out with. If you look at all of the most creative, productive people in history, they almost always were operating within an environment where they were surrounded by other creative people working on interesting stuff. And that sort of thing, whether, it's like Florence or whether it's Los Alamos or wherever, you have to find that place for you. And now those places are online. And so I think it's about being willing to put yourself out there and be vulnerable, but to do it in a way where you're doing it as part of a community and where you're finding the other people who want to do and think about and talk about the same things as you. And if you can find those people and then you can be vulnerable with them, and you can dedicate yourselves collectively to the craft that you're working on, whatever it is, right? Whether that's joining a DAO and participating in building something, whether that's finding a community of programmers or podcasters or writers or whatever, right? It doesn't matter what, as long as it's something that you're really excited about and that you can find a community of other people that are really excited about, and you can push each other. That's how you make the magic on the internet.
This is a new and strange environment at first, suddenly finding yourself in orbit.
I'm Neville Andrew Mera, and this is Never Normal, a show about breaking free from the boring default plan and living life on your terms instead.
My guest for this episode is Jonathan Hillis. John is at the forefront of so many interesting areas in technology right now. John's the founder of Creator Cabins, which started as a single cabin in the Texas Hill Country, a place where creators can gather together to work on exciting projects face-to-face. They've since launched a token and formed the Cabin DAO, and now they're expanding into a decentralized city. We also discussed John's excellent essay on the history of centralization and decentralization cycles, and John's perspective on the gig economy. We cover all of that and more in this episode. John, welcome to Never Normal.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm going to try to do a sort of like Tyler Cowen and skip all the usual kind of preamble-y introduction, soft questions, and just like dive right into the meat of it. You recently published a brief history of decentralized cities and centralized states. And I love that you overlaid that whole narrative on top of the timeline of the communication technologies from like the phonetic alphabet and obviously Gutenberg. And then even, a lot of references to VCs and Jim Barksdale's famous bundling and unbundling. I totally see that kind of parallel. And I'm curious, they say history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, I think is the expression. And there are some obvious parallels to the collapse of some previous empires and sort of where we are in the United States right now. Ray Dalio's talked a lot about this. It's the subject of his new book. Balaji's gone on record quite a bit talking about things like this. So having just written this history, sort of where do you see us in this cycle and where do you see all this going next?
I love the, the sort of history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes meme. And I think this is a great example of it. So, for context, for anyone who hasn't read it, the essay kind of walks through the 4 widely understood by historian phases of Western civilization and talks about, the sort of ancient period, which is like, Sumerians, Egyptians, emergence of agriculture, dank river valleys, etc. The classical period of Greek city-states, Roman Empire, the medieval period, knights, kings, castles, churches, and modern period of sort of the Renaissance, the Enlightenment and industrialization. And I was really trying to understand, if there were prior historical examples of decentralized cities, because that's what I'm most interested in and what I'm working on right now. And it turns out there are. It turns out in each of these areas, you see this pattern of some new set of coordination technologies that emerges, and then those coordination technologies unlocking the ability for small groups of people to work together and to build new forms of self-governance that turn into these city-like structures that then federate into these networks of city-like structures that look a lot like decentralized cities. and then that get, sort of eaten by centralized structures. And so if you think about where, your question was, where are we right now? I think historians would generally say we're in the modern era. And I think I would even posit that maybe we're right at the transition from the modern era to the next era, which people often talk about as like the information age or something like that. But basically the idea is that, the combination of computers, the internet, and blockchains are the coordination and communication technologies that are setting off a new cycle here. And this is coming right as we get to the point of, sort of the end of the last cycle, which is this classic situation of centralized systems and institutions starting to, outgrow themselves and, reach a state of eventual collapse. And so I think we seem to be, I'm like a very amateur historian here. So I think you have to take everything I say about it probably with a grain of salt. But it sure seems like we're at this sort of transition phase between the collapse of the, kind of like centralized nation state structure as the primary organizational structure for civilization and the emergence of this new, information age that I believe is heading in the direction and I'm interested in building in the direction of new decentralized cities.
If I can prod a little bit, so I mentioned Ray Dalio and Balaji. I mean, Ray Dalio kind of contrasts, where we are with some previous empires, and he's almost kind of warning us like, hey, watch out for a civil war because it looks an awful lot like we're headed that way. Balaji sort of pits like the US and China as these two sort of main forces in the world right now. And in a way, you could, I'm putting words in his mouth, but you could sort of read his argument as like, the US isn't centralized enough to compete with China. Like China's able to just get stuff done. And meanwhile, we're all arguing with each other and fighting over like identity politics while they're, building high-speed trains and new airports and all that kind of stuff. And he sort of predicts that like there's this sort of third way of decentralization that could sort of emerge. Do you see that? And do you see historical examples of that kind of happening within those places? Or like is decentralization a sort of necessary creative destruction? Or is it like this parallel thing that happens?
Great questions. I'm less familiar with the recent Dalio book, though I did have a couple people reach out after this essay and suggest I check it out. And also some suggest I don't check it out. The Balaji stuff I'm very familiar with. I've been attending the lecture series that he's putting on right now as part of 1729 and I've listened to a lot of his Tim Ferriss podcasts, et cetera. So I think he's got a lot of interesting stuff to say. You asked a couple questions there. So one was about like the historical precedents of where we find ourselves. And I think there's, basically like if you look at the three previous peak centralization precedents to, nation states, you have like river valley empires like the Egyptians, you have the Roman Empire, and then you have like late stage medieval kingdoms and Catholic churches. And I would argue that, there's elements of what we're seeing right now and what people sometimes refer to as, late stage capitalism that are really, I would call it not actually late stage capitalism, but more like late stage nation state centralization, which is a lot less catchy, but I think more accurate. And I think what, sort of the characteristics of that harken back to each of those previous eras. Ancient Egypt at its sort of state of peak centralization had a lot of insecure self-glorification that manifested itself in building giant pyramids. And I think there's definitely some of that, going on in the United States, this sort of like insecure self-glorification of like making America great again. The classic like late Roman Empire was a wild thing that I would definitely recommend people learn more about if they haven't. I had no idea like how insane it was, but it basically was a combination of this like just mass appeasement of providing Roman Empire citizens with a constant state of, free bread in the form of like a sort of universal basic income of bread and bathhouses and, sexual promiscuity and in circuses where it was basically just like murdering people. And that's all pretty nuts, and obviously like a more extreme than anything we're seeing right now. But I do think we're starting to see some of the, sort of like mass appeasement of universal basic income, which I think actually, there's some like good things to be said about universal basic income, but it at least is an example of like how democracy can get to the point where it becomes like, hey, let's just print money and give it to everybody, as well as sort of the crumbling infrastructure that was rampant in late stage classical Rome. And then, you also see some of the kind of like shedding of moral authority that happened in the late medieval period, and was particularly, the example there that's probably most common is the Catholic Church handing out indulgences and, allowing people to sort of like buy their way to heaven or something like that. And I think, we've, again, maybe less extreme versions right now, but certainly a fair amount of shedding of moral authority by, the United States on a global stage. So I think that's the historical context. And then the other question you had was about, sort of Balaji's take that it's actually maybe that China is sort of the like peak centralization and the United States is actually more of like a federated structure. So I think that's fair. And of course, like all of these sort of grand historical narratives, it's very easy to poke holes in them or to come up with alternate perspectives because they are inherently grand historical narratives that like are narratives, they're stories. And I think they can be helpful stories, but that doesn't mean they're perfectly accurate or work in all cases. In this case, though, I think what we've seen with the United States is that it was intended to be a federalist structure, and that this is actually the same trend you see with, as these decentralized cities emerge, they start to federate. You get the sort of like the case here would be New England towns that were spinning off New England towns and then federating into Articles of Confederation and ultimately the Constitution. But then over the past 100 years, there really was a centralization of that. And in the United States, we went, from more of a kind of like state first federated structure to, maybe post-Civil War centralization. And again, there's like a lot of historical context there that I'm not going to get into, but is important. But like I think the Balaji case that's particularly interesting here is that centralization peaked essentially with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so I think I would actually agree with Balaji's take here. I think the nuance is that he would say maybe we've already seen peak centralization and that now we are starting to, kind of in his words, like play the clock backwards towards a more decentralized state. And that this is actually like the way that America makes its like phoenix emerging from the ashes comeback, is that China is continuing on the path of centralization, which is like very effective in the short term, but probably less effective in the long term. And that America actually has an opportunity, particularly in the context of crypto, and particularly in the context of our like original, federalist structure to, be a place that is the home of this next wave of decentralization.
That's a bright future. It's an optimistic take. I like it. I hope it works out that way. I mean, I could sort of see if you play that forward and you add in the kind of crypto narrative, that's something like America's advantage is the fact that Wyoming is innovating, with DAOs being treated like LLCs, and Miami is innovating by bringing a lot of the crypto world there, and that we're sort of running these kind of 50 experiments in parallel, and out of that will emerge something better and more maybe robust or even anti-fragile than a sort of consensus down from the top competitor. Whether the people at the top allow that to take place or they at some point, step in with whether that's something like SEC regulation or just like a more heavy hand of government in general and kind of taking back more of that power into a centralized government, I think time will tell.
Yep. I think that's exactly the question. And I would even say it's not just like a 50 state experiment, but maybe even like hundreds of cities experiment. Obviously there's a lot inherent to the US Constitution that sets it up for the ability for states to, in the sort of realm of the 10th Amendment, like claim their sovereignty in a way that like is actually relatively in line with the original intent of the Constitution and, allows for these experiments. But I think what's going to be more interesting here is actually even just like city innovation. And, I think you mentioned Miami, which is a prominent example, but I think we're going to see this this in not only a lot of current states, but in our current cities, but in these like new emerging concepts of cities. And I think that that type of experimentation has a lot of cultural DNA baked into the United States that makes it pretty interesting. And frankly, like you're right, it's an optimistic take, but it's also like the reality is I'm not sure that in the long run the federal government really has the like tools or capabilities in its toolkit to continue to be the type of powerful structure that it was in the 20th century. And there's like you look at, I think like an interesting example here from science fiction is Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash, right? Which is sort of becoming a classic reemergence of like, oh, wow, he really predicted a lot of what's happening right now. And I think some of the stuff around burb-claves is just starting to kick off, though hopefully in like slightly less of a cyberpunk and slightly more of like a solar punk version of it. But
less dystopian, but
yeah, a little less dystopian, hopefully. But there is a funny moment in Snow Crash where they're like getting on a helicopter and this dude hops on the helicopter with them and they're like, who's this guy? He's like, oh, I'm the president of the United States. And they're like, okay, cool, whatever, man, sit in the back. And so I don't think it's that like the federal government is going away, but I do think that it's that it may just become less relevant over time.
So that's actually, you handed me a beautiful segue as the founder of Creator Cabins, which is itself a decentralized city built by and for creators. Obviously, this is something that you've thought a lot about. Is your hope that is a sort of, this is such a nerdy reference, but like I remember when like new graphics cards would come out, like NVIDIA would make these like reference drivers, and then all the various people who used their chipsets in the cards would make like their own version of the drivers or something like that. So is this kind of like the standard prototype, I guess is the word I'm struggling for, that you then hope people will sort of copy paste into additional cities around the world? And then is there some idea that those federate together, or how does all that kind of fit together in your mind?
So there's the like at the emergence of the last cycle of decentralized cities, which had its home in like New England towns. There's this famous John Winthrop speech about a city on a hill, which is essentially what you're describing. It's like, let's make a reference city for this new mode of democracy. I like to joke that we're like a city on a side of a hill, quite on top of a hill, but we're like on the side of one. I think that's like a little bit of a self-aggrandizing reference probably. But I do hope that in some sense what we're building here is something that other people can look at and be inspired by. And also, not just in terms of inspiration, but in terms of like very practical, right? Like we want to create the toolkit and the playbook, right? So that anybody can go and make one of these things. And, we're trying to be very intentional about how we build infrastructure and build cabins and these sorts of things in like highly repeatable ways so that we can enable other people to kind of pursue this same dream. Because I think there are a lot of people out there that want to try something different. They want to, be out in nature, but with fast internet, which is a new thing that you can do, right? That you couldn't do even 10 years ago, and kind of live that lifestyle. I think a lot of people dream of like being with, a group of close friends where they're in a highly walkable space, they're out in nature, but they're still connected. And, maybe even can sort of have a rotating cast of people, friends from the internet that are sort of dropping in. And we want to help enable that, not only in terms of, and to be clear, it's not a copy paste of what we're doing here. We want to provide a template, but part of what's so exciting and cool about these sort of like decentralized city nodes is that they allow us to rapidly and in parallel experiment with a bunch of different types of organizational structures, governance structures, while sharing some core cultural values, that allow people to feel a sense of connection across different nodes.
So instead of copy paste, perhaps the better analogy would be fork the code base, right? Where there's parts in common and things that you're innovating on. One of the reasons why I think this is so interesting, and especially your approach, is that there's been a lot of efforts in this direction over the years, at least in terms of like just people who want to kind of break free from like a powerful central government. And there's been things like seasteading, and then there was Sealand, I think I think it was like a defense structure originally off the coast of England, and some maritime law change meant that while it was once inside the UK territorial waters, it was no longer, and so somebody claimed it, and there was a pirate radio station, and like there have been these various sort of like half-baked attempts at starting a new country. And this is even something I've not quite sparred with Balaji on, but like his take on all of this is sort of like, go out and like grab some unclaimed land and build something. And I sort of wonder, and what I've pushed back on him and said, couldn't it be something more like this, like Hanseatic League, where it's, okay, we've got these sort of various cities that have kind of opted into these principles, and they may not agree on everything, but there's a certain core set of like, whether that's the currency or the certain kind of governance principles that they have in common, and maybe there's like freedom of movement between those places or just some mutual recognition. Is that something that you've thought about? Do you see this going in that direction? Is that too utopian and idealistic?
Yeah. It's a great question. So, yeah, I think, kind of within this movement to try new governance structures, try new, organizational structures for people, it's a spectrum. And I think you're right. On sort of one side of the spectrum, you have like seasteading, or you have, and then like one step, in on the spectrum, you have some of the groups like Pronomis who are like, let's carve out these special economic zones where we get to like make our own laws and stuff like that. I would say we're like further on the other end of the spectrum, which is that, to your point, it's less about like, I am not like some hardcore libertarian, nor do I think like cabin members in general tend to be hardcore libertarians. I think what we are is people who want to experiment with new structures and try to, make localized organizations that are a better fit for people's day-to-day lives. And I think you can do a lot of that within or adjacent to existing structures. So like, we're not building walls and like putting guns on them and trying to like declare sovereignty. At best, what we're doing is LARPing as a city state. And I think the LARP has a lot of power to it. We have our own, like you said, sort of native token or currency. We've got passports. So like, I'll hold up this is my cabin passport. It's, a card with a chip embedded in it with a private key that can hold NFT visas or whatever that can be scanned and used to access things. We're making these things but we're treating it as a LARP, right? Nobody is like saying, let's secede from the United States or whatever country, a node is in. What we're saying is like, within the context of these existing systems, let's play games and explore local governance structures and explore ways of building community and culture and cities. And if you look at the history of this stuff, I think that's actually much more in line with what works. To your point about, these sort of federated leagues of the past, what we tend to see is that when these new, decentralized cities are emerging, they're not saying we have absolute sovereignty and like that sort of thing. That actually tends to be what the centralized organizations do later on. What the decentralized cities tend to do is, you look at like federated city states of the classical era, or the sort of like market towns evolving into trade leagues in the medieval era. And they tend to be much more about like, how do we create conditions of economic viability and, ways for people to improve their standard of living, typically originally within the context of the existing structures. We're in an unincorporated area at our first node here in the Texas Hill Country. We're in a situation where like, the cabin we built required a single $100 septic and well permit to be filed with the county. And other than that, they didn't want to know anything about what we were up to, And that's like a real advantage of being in an unincorporated area of Texas versus, say, a suburb in California. And so, of course, like we talked about with the sort of federated structure of the United States, there's a whole range of types of local government. And I think there's a lot of bandwidth to sort of play and explore, within that range that doesn't require some sort of like grand gesture of declaring sovereignty or something.
Yeah, and I think that it's a lot less risky to try stuff like that, and it enables sort of more iteration, and it's just less of like a crazy move basically to do something like that. And then it's almost like a startup in stealth mode. Maybe, in a good case scenario, something like what you're describing just keeps getting propagated and keeps working and iterating, and then all of a sudden it becomes the new default at some point in history. That's like, that it just sort of switched when no one was paying attention.
Sorry, yeah, I think this is the magic of these new coordination tools and the way that these things evolve. Like you said, it would be totally crazy in any of these eras right? For some group to be like, oh yeah, this big centralized power, we're gonna like go overthrow them. Like that's not how you win this game. The way you win this game is just by providing better outcomes for people, right? And like you said, it's like a startup. It's like the classic sort of Clay Christensen disruption theory. Like you don't sort of attack the big incumbents head on. You just start making, systems and structures and products that are like much better on a specific dimension that people choose to opt into in like a market-based way.
So this is exactly the point that I've tried to make to people when I think about like digital countries and future forms of government. And it goes back to your Jim Barksdale bundling and unbundling. And I just think that there's an opportunity right now to unbundle some of the things that we typically think of as being provided by central governments. I mean, so the super cliched obvious example is Bitcoin. Like the US dollar doesn't have to cease to exist for me to hold Bitcoin in my digital wallet. Both can coexist. And I can see a future form of digital, you said LARPing, so I'll go with that, sort of LARPing as government entity that does things, whether it's birth certificates or death certificates, marriage certificates, all those kinds of things. Or even, you could even get something like, not a full-fledged court system, but like, two people could make a contract between them and opt into making the jurisdiction of that contract some future organization that has their best interest in mind, that is not like the local government court system. There's all sorts of things that right now are just sort of like de facto part of government. There's no real reason why they necessarily need to be part of that like local government system, in the same way that like we just have this kind of prior that like governments issue money, but actually there's no reason why you can't just make Bitcoin and not be a government. And I think we're going to start to see a lot of those examples pop up as like parallel systems, basically.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, to take the Bitcoin analogy a little bit further and apply it to some of those other things you were talking about, which are essentially like documentation of people and things, that's what blockchains are really good at, right? Is a public ledger that's immutable that anybody can look at and everybody can agree on a source of truth without a centralized entity. And so if you think about ultimately things like, a lot of like government sources of truth, whether that's the sort of things you were talking about, like birth and death certificates, or whether that's things more like land titles. Those things are actually things that are a great fit for blockchains. And my favorite historical example here, Texas history is crazy. And if you look at like the brief period where Texas was its own country, there was this time where Austin was the capital of Texas, but Sam Houston was the president of Texas. And Sam Houston decided he actually wanted, the capital of Texas to be in his namesake town of Houston. And so he literally just showed up with a bunch of like armed, dudes at the Austin Capitol and tried to steal all the records and move them to Houston. And this innkeeper, I think her name was Angelina Eberly. There's a statue of her outside of the Austin Capitol with a cannon, because she literally like came out at night and like got one of the cannons and started firing on the president of Texas and the troops that were trying to steal all the records. And like, this is a perfect example of the type of thing where it's like, yeah, the government ultimately is like the place where the records are kept. And if you can just steal those things and move them, then you can in some sense steal the government. And so having blockchains as this way for us to have an immutable shared understanding of the sources of truth of those records that is not reliant on, physical records being in a location, in maybe a slightly less extreme case, like a local courthouse that burns down and suddenly you've like lost all the property records for that county. That's a huge opportunity for blockchains. And I would hope that current government structures could figure that out. But frankly, given their track record of adopting new technologies, I'm a little skeptical.
Yeah, I wasn't going to go here, but you've provoked me. For anyone listening who thinks that this, it's like this kind of stuff just works pretty well right now, like why do we need innovation? I'm actually sitting in Valencia in Spain. I got married. We had like the ceremony and the party and everything in Portugal, but for all these like legal reasons of hassle and paperwork and everything, we decided that would just be like, that was the only wedding we had. That was the real wedding, but the actual legal whole wedding was like us signing a piece of paper back home in Washington, D.C. It was way easier to just, not have to translate Portuguese documents and whatever. But then we go and move to Spain. And so now we need to prove to Spain that we're married. So I asked the D.C. government for a copy of my marriage certificate. Okay, it took days. They were super backed up. Sorry, normally it takes days. They were super backed up. It took weeks. But then I have to get it apostilled. So they mail me a certificate and I mail it back to a different branch of the government. You can't do it in person because of COVID, who then apostilles that document for use internationally. I left the US by that point. I sent a copy of it to my dad, who was in the States, who then promptly put it in an envelope and mailed it to me here in Spain. It sat in customs. It's just a document. There's literally nothing else in there. He didn't include like a batch of cookies or something. It was just a piece of paper in an envelope. Somehow it sat in customs at Madrid airport for a month. And then finally I get this notice in the mail from the postal service here that I have a package waiting for me, but I need to pay duty to pick it up. So I go to the post office and they charge me something like 20 euros to pick up hilariously crumpled piece of paper that looked like it got run over by a truck in an envelope, so that I could then file that with the local government here to prove that we are in fact actually married. So it's like, even today in
absolutely bonkers.
Yeah, in the 21st century with all the technology that we have, like that's how this stuff works on a global level. And maybe that's an extreme example, but I sold a house in 2020, not to make this my life story. And I found out just a few weeks ago that the settlement agency, when you sell a piece of property, the buyers and sellers meet together. Well, we did it virtually, but there's still like an office where all this stuff gets signed and they, pay all the people who need to be paid and all that. So we did all that. I got the money, everything worked. So I thought, and I find out I got a tax bill for the property tax for this year. And I'm like, okay, that's weird. That's some clerical error. I wrote to the tax agency and they're like, no, the house is still in your name. So I sold a house a year and a half ago. The settlement agency, cue the "you had one job" meme, never filed the deed with the government. So I legally still own that house. Now, I'm not, a crook, so I'm not going to steal the house back from the guy, but somebody has already paid me hundreds of thousands of dollars for real property, and there's no record that says that he owns it. And of course, his bank who gave him the mortgage is furious because they have no secured loan.
That is insane. And yeah, this is something I didn't realize, that this is there's a whole cottage industry of insurance for deeds, for just proving that you own the thing that you own. And it's wild. It's and things happen, right? This is paperwork. This is humans. Mistakes are made. Courthouses burned down, right? My parents live out in another, area of the whole country. And unfortunately, some, not very mentally stable guy just burned down the local courthouse. And they were very fortunate to have a deep clean and restoration process. And so a lot of the records had been moved out. But it's the sort of thing where it's well, what do you do when just all the records of ownership of everything just disappear, right? And this happens if you read in history. Again, you see this all the time where records just got burned or lost or whatever. And then there's whole industries just dedicated to proving and having insurance for and keeping alternate, copies of records of things that the government is supposed to have records of. And it's just a totally wild system that probably made a whole lot of sense when we didn't have better ways of doing it. But it's certainly at least worth exploring some of these new technologies that are a pretty great fit for this use case.
I want to pivot from my struggles with getting documents figured out and just touch briefly on something that you mentioned in passing, that you're in the Texas Hill Country outside Austin, and a little bit about the history of Austin. I've actually never been, I'm ashamed to admit, but I can't help but notice it feels like my entire Twitter feed lives in or around Austin, Texas, or is in the process of moving there, right? Famously, Joe Rogan is out there now. Tim Ferriss moved a few years ago, and I think was kind of early in the wave of San Francisco and the Bay Area moving to Austin. And then a lot of the intellectuals and thinkers from Ryan Holiday to David Perel, Nat Eliason. There's a ton of people who I read and follow online are all in or around Austin. It feels like it's almost like what Vienna was 100 years ago. To what do you attribute that to? What's going on in Austin?
Look, I'm very biased here. I was born and raised in Austin and grew up there, spent the first 18 years of my life there, and then left for about a decade and just came back recently, spent most of that decade in the Bay Area. And I think a couple things are happening. First of all, there's the obvious stuff, which is just COVID broke the dam of San Francisco being the sort of technology hub. And suddenly there was this, Nash equilibrium of exit from San Francisco, and people were trying to figure out where to go next. And I think the winners of that were certainly New York City and LA and Miami, but also Austin. And Austin's the one on that list where you're like, those other places are all like very big cities. Austin is a little smaller. Why is it on the list? Austin has a couple principles that I think make it a really good fit for the type of people that you just described who are moving there in mass. And by the way, it is true. It's not just your Twitter feed. It's been pretty incredible over the last year to, go to so many different gatherings, parties, dinners, events with like large groups of super interesting internet intellectuals, many of whom don't know each other. Like, it's not just like there's one group of people hanging out. It's like lots of different pockets, of people with different flavors of cool, interesting stuff going on. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that Austin has been growing at a consistent rate since the 1850s. And so Austin's been growing about 8% annually for, over 150 years now. And so it is a place of constant change and a place of constant growth, and pretty much always has been. And so, as a result, I think the culture of it is very different from the culture of, for instance, San Francisco, which is like in many ways pretty anti-growth. And Austin has gotten, and we're starting to see some like unfortunate trends in the opposite direction. But I think generally Austin has been pretty good at incorporating new people and, growing the culture. I also think, it's just like a pretty ideal place in terms of like keep Austin weird has always been the slogan. There's a lot of like live music and artists and I view Austin as kind of the independent online creator capital. If you think about, those other cities and sort of what piece of San Francisco they ended up with, New York ended up with like the fintech and the, decentralized finance stuff is probably like most there. Miami ended up with like, I don't know, the kids with Lambos or something like the sort of part of tech that I don't personally really identify with. LA maybe ended up with like fashion and like whatever high culture piece. And I think Austin ended up with all the parts that I identify with, which is like the independent online creators, the independent thinkers, all the sort of people you just mentioned, who are people who I also follow and enjoy talking with and respect. And so, yeah, I think that is something that's been very cool to watch. And I think is like a pretty natural fit for this place.
Sort of prod you a little bit again and say you've got what I think of as somewhat of a contrarian view. Maybe we'll unpack this and realize it's not, but there seems to be like an emerging consensus that says remote work is great. Obviously, I've been a fan. Any regular listeners know I've been a fan for a long time. But there's this emerging consensus that says remote work is great if you've already got, let's say, a job or at least a network. Like if you've established yourself in some community or in some way, and now you can just like reap all the lifestyle benefits of being remote, like move to a city that's cheaper or better in some way. You're just not constrained. Like you already have the Wall Street job and the Wall Street salary, but you're not stuck paying the Manhattan rents, right? Like that seems to be the thing. But if you're early in your career, if you don't know anybody yet, if you haven't established yourself, you don't have a network, then it's sort of like people are saying remote is kind of like almost like handcuffs for you because it stops you from being able to make those connections. And just kind of piecing together different bits of your work, I almost feel like you're saying the opposite, that like the place to meet people is on Twitter and in Discord rooms, but when it comes to actually doing the work, once you found your tribe or whatever, you should get together in a cabin and like do some kind of a sprint towards working on a project because meet space is the higher bandwidth than the real world. Do I have your take right? And if so, what's everybody else getting wrong?
That's a fantastic question. And I hadn't really considered that as being a contrarian view. But when you frame it that way, I think you're right. It's definitely different than the mainstream take. Yes. So if you look at, like dating apps are probably the best example of this. There's no more highly motivated group of people, searching for connections with other people than the dating pool. And what we've seen over the past decade, you can find like insane charts on this where basically like, and it's no surprise, right? We've all like experienced this with our friends who are dating or maybe dating ourselves, we've gone from this world where you met people at church or, work or whatever, these like IRL situations. All of that has just totally fallen off the cliff. And the one thing that's just completely taken over as the primary way people meet is online on dating apps. And then, of course, they get together IRL and spend time together. And the reason for that is because the pool of people on the internet is so much bigger than the pool of people who you're ever going to be in the same place with in person. And the filtering mechanisms are so much better. It's not just like you show up to a party and like, I don't know how you decide at a party who to talk to, basically, like, some combination of like who's not talking to other people and like who's standing near you and like, whatever other factors that are totally irrelevant to, your ability to connect with a person. Whereas on the internet, it's a huge pool. And then you can really find your specific corner of that world where you really resonate with people, whether that's a subreddit or Discord or a corner of Twitter that you hang out in. You can really find people who you resonate with, and then you can get together with them in real life. And I think that's a much smarter way to build deep connections. That said, I also don't believe that like you should spend all of your working time IRL with people. I think you can do probably 80-90% of it remote and asynchronously. But the really important part is that 10% where you do get together, you have high bandwidth reality to build connections and trust and relationships and have like deep, meaningful conversations that are much harder to do on Zoom. And I think the liminal time and space of being together IRL unlocks the type of conversations that you're just never going to schedule time for and like hop on a call for. So, I think people talk a lot about there's like in-person maxis, there's remote maxis. I'm certainly neither of those. I'm more of like believer in a happy medium. But I think what people get wrong about hybrid is, the like standard definition of like hybrid work right now is like 2 days a week in the office, 3 days a week at home. That is just as limiting. You have to be in one place if you're going to be getting together every week with the people. And then you also have this problem of like doing a meeting where, some people are in the office and some people are remote is just like the worst of all worlds. And so the version of hybrid that I think makes the most sense is for the vast majority of time, you go live wherever you want, you do whatever you want, remote, asynchronous, but then you get together everybody in the same place for a week or 2 weeks, and you have that like really important in-person experience a couple times a year.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you on that. And I think that the companies who've been doing remote well and who've been doing it for a long time and have been successful, like Automatic and Buffer and others, even before COVID and everything else necessitated this and it became normal, like they'd already sort of figured that out, that this works really well. We can hire from anywhere in the world. We're working 24 hours a day because people are in their own time zones. So we get all these benefits, but there's still something to be said, even though they'd figured out that part of the culture early on, like there's still something to be said for getting everybody together and just having FaceTime. There's like the social benefit of it, but then also obviously the work benefit of it, where there's like, you're not just getting the work done, but you're maybe inventing the next big thing or whatever it is. And maybe some of this comes down to like, as far as which one of these visions is right, maybe some of it comes down to my old favorite question of like what you're optimizing for, right? And maybe the people who are kind of saying the opposite view that like, oh, for your network and everything else, it's better to have had a career first. Maybe they're just sort of thinking more within like a particular company or something like that. And if you're hanging out in weird corners of the internet, then it's just a totally different game that you're playing. You're not trying to sort of become the boss's favorite, by showing up in person and then taking that remote. It's more about, finding the people that share your weird particular interests or who value your creativity or something like that.
I think that's exactly the right distinction. And I think this is where we're going to see DAOs really shine in the next decade, right? Is like you said, it makes a lot of sense to want to spend the first couple of years of your career IRL if you're trying to like ingratiate yourself to some boss. But if you're trying to build reputation within a network, then you can actually do that much better in the context of things like DAOs.
So let's talk about that transition, not just DAOs, but more generally just going from sort of like the corporate world to whether it's a creator economy or DAOs or Web3 and all of that, but just moving from like a traditional stable corporate job. So you left Instacart, was it about a year ago now?
Yeah, almost exactly a year ago.
And what kind of made it finally the right time to leave? What caused you to leave? And I've seen the stuff that you've done since then, but I don't know if that's exactly, if did you leave to build creator cabins and do the things you're doing now, or what was going on in your mind there that made it the right time?
There's a point in 2019 where I was pretty burnt out on my work. And my boss at the time, David Hahn, our chief product officer, just sort of looked at me and said, "Hey man, like you need to go take a month off." I hadn't taken a vacation in a long time. He's like, "You need to just take a month off and go sit on a beach somewhere and like think about what you want to do with your life." Which was totally the right advice. And I was very grateful for him doing that. And I did like the next week, I flew, somewhat stereotypically to like a remote island off of the southwestern coast of Thailand and just hung out there and, did some like designing your life exercises and wrote a bunch of like possible 5-year paths for myself and really thought about what I wanted to do. And one of the things that came out of that process was the seeds of what I'm doing now. And I went back and actually when I was in a position where I really needed to like plan out my exit from the company because I was sort of deeply involved in some core stuff. And so planned it all out, was like I had my scheduled leave date was the first week of May of 2020. The like first week of February, I started telling my team I was going to leave. And, then of course COVID happened. And all of a sudden, my role at Instacart, I led the shoppers and marketplace teams. And so suddenly we needed 500,000 new Instacart shoppers overnight to deal with all of the demand. And so it was not going to be an ideal time for me to walk away. So I agreed to stay on for 6 more months and, sort of saw it through the early phases of our pandemic response and was really proud of the work that the team did and the work that shoppers did during that period. But then, ultimately knew that I was going to leave. And so started exploring, what had interested me most at Instacart was the role of the gig economy in creating new types of autonomous, relatively independent work for people. And some of that, didn't play out exactly how I hoped it would in the context of Web2 platforms. But I think the underlying idea was that, in the 70s, there was this guy named Ronald Coase who wrote this piece called The Nature of the Firm, where it ended up winning a Nobel Prize. And he was talking about like the idea that like companies shouldn't actually exist if you just take economic theory first principles, like companies don't make sense. And so he was like, why do companies exist? Well, they exist because of transaction costs, because it's too hard for everybody to be a contractor and just work with each other because you have to like deal with all the paperwork basically. And what the gig economy, unlocked for me was this realization that software dramatically lowers the transaction costs of people working together. And you can, when you lower those barriers, you get structures that don't look like companies. And the first examples of that were these Web2 gig economy companies. But that same principle, I realized, was going to start applying to knowledge workers. And the way, I wasn't sure exactly how that was going to play out, but I got super interested in the creator economy and starting to understand how knowledge workers were becoming more independent and autonomous, and then started exploring crypto stuff and, ended up starting this thing called the Creator CoOp, which was this group of independent online creators wanted to go build a cabin in the woods. That was like the actual plan, right? Post Instacart, everything else was just kind of like for fun. And I was like, I'm burnt out. I'm going to go build a cabin in the woods with my wife and we're just going to hang out and I'm going to like get away from it all for a while. I failed miserably at that. I mean, we built the cabin, but I did not stop doing things. And so we brought out the Creator CoOp group and, we're sitting around a campfire one night and decided to take some of these principles we were talking about kind of the future of organizations and cooperation and independent online workers and turn that into a DAO, which became Cabin, the DAO. And, originally the idea was just like, let's provide a space, a liminal time and space for independent online creators to come together and a residency program for that. And I think what we've seen is that the emergent process of creating a place for knowledge workers and independent online creators to come together and think about these things has led to something much bigger than what we anticipated.
Started with a cabin, and now we're talking about, like, should nation states still exist? Do they have a place in our modern world? I love
exactly. Funny, I did not, I couldn't have predicted this. Again, I'm not some like hardcore libertarian guy. I don't think anybody else that's a part of the Cabin network would describe themselves that way. We're just, independent online creators who are kind of out on the edges and the frontier of this stuff, and we're starting to poke into some really interesting big questions.
Yeah, I mean, you can also look at it as sort of like this generation of us that grew up sort of experimenting with permissionlessly with bits has moved on to atoms, right? Like where we were all
absolutely
thinking about the gig economy. I mean, this is a question I wrestle with myself in the sense of so you were in a funny position at Instacart, as I think about it, in the sense that you were working for like a big VC backed company as an employee, making gig economy work possible for lots of people. I think you said you 5x the number of shoppers that you had, who I presume were all gig economy workers, probably 1099, maybe depending on the local regulations. There is this sort of debate, like, is this freedom for the worker? Is the gig economy something where it's like the utopian view is like, you can sort of turn on and turn off work when you want to, right? Something like Uber or Instacart makes work elastic. If I was a driver, 50 years ago, and I wanted to go visit my family in my home country, I'd need to ask for vacation and plan all the stuff. Whereas now it's like, I want to go out tonight. I need some more money. Okay, I'll drive a few extra shifts. Oh, next week I want to go visit my family. Okay, I won't log into the app. And it's like, there's this sort of perfect view of it. And then there's the counterpoint, which is you used to be able to get a job with a salary and benefits and maybe even a pension. And now it's like you're only as good as like, that last fare, that last gig that you did, that last trip that was, $5 in your pocket or something like that. Where do you sort of come down on this? Are both right? Or how do you kind of look at that?
Yeah, I mean, I think almost necessarily they both have elements of truth to them. When I was getting started at Instacart and in sort of Web2 gig economy, I was, and I think all of us were, very optimistic about what it was going to allow for people to do. And I think we were very excited about it. And when we talked to shoppers, right, I did a tremendous amount of user research with the team. And those were the things shoppers really talked about, was the autonomy, the independence, the flexibility, the ability to earn money almost instantly without someone, deciding when they could work a shift or deciding, whether or not they could have the job. Like, it was really put a lot of power in the hands of individuals. And that was something we were really excited about. And that was why I was so attracted, particularly to the shopper side of the platform and the opportunity to build software for gig workers. Now, of course, as you said, as the gig economy grew and as these things played out, I think it was easy in retrospect to look back and think, yeah, we were probably a little bit overly optimistic about some of these outcomes and didn't anticipate some of the downsides that emerged. And part of what, really drew me to Web3 was the fact that it provides a lot of good solutions to the problems that ended up, becoming issues in the context of gig work in Web 2. So I think the hope now with Web 3 is that you can solve some of these problems by providing higher degrees of ownership and governance and, the ability for people who are impacted by the decisions of the networks to have a say in those networks more directly, which I think was the thing that was really missing in the context of these Web2 platforms. Now, that said, I think it's also a good opportunity for us to learn from past mistakes and really think critically about how Web3 is going to evolve, because I tend to be perhaps a little bit of a techno-optimist and a believer that, these things can create really positive new outcomes for people. But as we saw in Web 2, as I personally saw, I didn't fully anticipate some of the negative consequences of that. And so I don't know that I have great answers here, but I do know that we all probably need to be spending more time not just thinking about the optimistic case for how this stuff evolves, but also the ways that it can go wrong.
Yeah, to that point, there was a really good, thought-provoking anyway, piece from Moxie Marlinspike, the Signal creator, on I'm sure you read it, on like the potential pitfalls of Web3, I'll call it. I won't necessarily take all the concerns, straight at face value, but I think I think right now what we're seeing are a lot of people who are aping in to the sort of Web3 narrative. And yes, like the theoretical ideal of, let's say, like an Uber that's owned collectively by the drivers and the passengers who own some tokens perhaps in proportion to like their usage of the system or the amount they drive or something like that, so that all the outcomes are aligned. Sounds great, but we're not quite there yet, I would say.
No, we're certainly not there. And I don't think you can judge the values and vision of Web3 entirely by the current state. I think I'm glad that, he wrote that article, and I think it's good that people are providing well-structured, thoughtful, intentional critiques. I think we need more of that right now from people who are really diving in like he did, trying things out in Web3 and then coming back and saying, hey, this doesn't quite align with the principles and the values. But I also think like you got to cut early technologies some slack for not being the full realization of the long-term goals, because these are hard things that are going to take time.
We've been we've been jumping around a lot, but one thing that we've been sort of kind of mushing together is this idea of like the creator economy, the gig economy, and just sort of like entrepreneurship more generally, and wanting like, to create stuff, start companies. I used to see like those as sort of distinct things. I mean, going back, 10 or 15 years or something, there was, the idea of someone who was starting a startup who was probably a coder. And then there was like a blogger or someone like that who was just like, writing articles on WordPress and trying to get people to read them. Something that sort of flipped in my mind over the years is the idea that like those are actually maybe on the same continuum of people who are creating content online and then people who are ultimately building businesses. I mentioned David Perel in passing. He's a good example of somebody who, built a big Twitter following, built a big following with his essays and writing online, and now teaches people to write online and has this sort of much grander visions for what his company Rite of Passage could become. It sounds to me like you've probably thought even more about that with the way that I've heard you talk about creator cabins and just kind of the way you're thinking about Web3 and ownership and everything in general. So I'm curious, do you see that as like a sort of continuum with the idea of like creating content online and ultimately building and owning a business, or am I oversimplifying that?
I think that's spot on. I'm really glad you brought up David, because, Rite of Passage was actually, I went through the, Rite of Passage course, and that was where I met a lot of the folks who ended up being a part of the Creator CoOp, which was sort of the precursor to Cabin. And so
I had no idea. That's really cool.
Yeah, fantastic community. I've had the chance to spend some time with David and just have a tremendous amount of respect for what he's building, and have met a lot of wonderful humans through that community. So I that really resonates. I think that Balaji has also talked a little bit about this, that like the kind of future dynamic duo of a startup is like one founder who's a programmer and one founder who's like a basically content creator, because so much of like building a company and a brand right now is about storytelling. And if you look at Cabin, for instance, as a DAO, our sort of like two biggest and most active guilds are the media guild and the product guild. And I think like that's a really important combination of kind of like building the story and the narrative and also building the products. It's funny, I had forgotten until you mentioned it, that there was sort of this dynamic, if you go back 10 years ago, of people feeling like these were two very different things, like starting a company and being like an indie creator were like different things. Where like, if you really think about it, it's pretty clear that they're the same thing. They're like somebody, going out on their own and trying to build an independent business. And I actually, to bring this full circle, for one of the essays I wrote for David Perel's Rite of Passage course, I wrote an essay called 6 Economies of Online Creators. And I think there's actually a spectrum here where if you're trying to make $100,000 per year on the internet, there's sort of like 6 orders of magnitude of ways you can do that. You can make $1 per year from 100,000 people, which is sort of like the influencer economy, ads, micropayments, et cetera. You can make $10 per year from 10,000 people, right, which is sort of the gig economy, ebooks, drop shipping, transactional gigs. You can make $100 per year from 1,000 people, the fan economy, right? And this is sort of the classic Kevin Kelly 1,000 true fans, patrons, subscription newsletter content, et cetera. You can make $1,000 per year from 100 people, the passion economy, in Legion's terms, things like online courses, coaching, tutoring that we've really seen emerge over the past few years. And then you can make, $10,000 a year from 10 people, this sort of like indie economy where you're starting to get into like early stage startups or independent, niche SaaS, indie consulting, or you can make, $10,000 a year from one person, which is just a job. And so I think that like these things are much more on a spectrum than maybe people used to talk about or realize.
I think that's an amazing take. I think maybe it's just me, but I'm inclined to say that's probably under realized out in the world so far. The idea that all of those things are on that continuum, and that the skills that you need to build a large business these days more and more look like the skills that you need to build an online audience, because how else are you going to get noticed in this sort of media environment that we're in? This is the last question I have for you.
Yep.
Okay.
And by the way, on that note, yeah, just to dive into that a tiny bit more, this also ties into a lot of the stuff we were talking about with like network states, right? In sort of Balaji's terminology, which is that if you want to build not just a company, but also maybe a country, or at least a LARP as one, it's the same principle. It makes a lot more sense to build the audience online, to build the community online, to build the connections online, and then to start to take that stuff into the real world, whether that's building a business or building a nation state. It's the same principle. You wanna sort of manifest that stuff first in terms of the story and the online community.
That's amazing that you said that, because I have a goal. I was just going over my like annual review for last year and setting goals for this year, and I have a sort of persistent sticky goal, which is to build an audience. And on one hand, it sort of feels kind of like a vain and superficial goal, but I have a note to myself like, no, don't think of it that way, because everything else you want to do, including building a digital country, stems from this. Like, this is the one thing that unlocks everything else. This is the most like high leverage thing to achieve from my list of goals, beyond just as the sort of personal health and wellness and kind of spiritual things and family things. Like, among achievements, everything else stems from this, because whether you just want to get your ideas in the world, or build a big company, or even raise capital if that's the way you want to go, or disrupt the existing world order, they all start from having people who are interested in your ideas and listening to you, or just having an audience online.
Yeah, on that note, I want to maybe talk about something kind of personal there, which is like, I really struggled with that. Even a year ago when I left Instacart, I think I probably had something like 300 Twitter followers, and I didn't see myself as the type of person who was going to do that. And frankly, even I had the feeling of like, oh, it feels like a little grifty or shilly, or, whatever. A lot of these things I think people often have hangups about, to like go out and, do a lot of tweeting or whatever. And I think I came to the same realization you came to, which was that like, this is actually the only way to accomplish my goals. And so I need to take it seriously, and I need to get good at it. And I had a bit of a mental reframe, which hopefully might be helpful for some people, which is like, if you treat it not as like just shilling, but as like truly building in public and, sharing your journey in a way that can provide value to other people, then I think it really reframes the conversation. And so what I started doing was like, literally as, we were building the first cabin, I just started tweeting about it, right? I was like, okay, I'm like hauling stones out of the side of this hill to build a fire pit, today. And like I started with a Twitter poll, like, what should I build? You were like, build a fire pit. I was like, okay, cool. I'm going to do that. And I'm going to like tweet pictures of it and like whatever, and then, we were like pouring the foundation for the cabin. And I like was up at 3 a.m. with the crew pouring the cabin foundation. And I was just like live tweeting it and talking about how I thought the like structures of construction contractors related to the gig economy, and then that turned into an essay. And like, I just think you have to be willing to, reframe it from like, oh, I'm out here, like, who am I, kind of like sharing my random thoughts with the world, to like, hey, I'm building something and I'm just going to put that out in the world and, try to create opportunities for other people to engage with what I'm trying to build and create, and let them like be a part of the journey as well.
I love that. And I would just to build on top of what you're saying, what you're describing is something that I'm honestly not a huge fan of his. I haven't always listened to his stuff, but Gary Vaynerchuk talks about this idea of like documenting, right? Rather than, we think of creating content, you think of like, oh, back in school, I wrote this essay and I've got to have this like giant epiphany. But what you're describing, at least with the cabin, was something different, where you're just basically saying, hey, this is what I'm doing. And it's easy to be cynical about that and make fun of everybody sharing their lunch on social media or whatever. But that's actually the more authentic and interesting thing. Coming up with some pithy summary that, of like a hot take or whatever can be funny, can be interesting, can help you build an audience. But like what you're describing actually helps people connect with you more authentically. And it's easy for me to sit here and say that. But when it comes time to actually, be vulnerable and show the behind the scenes, not the perfect finish, I've already polished it thing that I've been working on for years, but hey, this is my shitty little thing I'm working on right now and it's not done yet, but hey, I'm showing it to the world anyway. That's the hard part, but that's what works.
It is. But the magic here, like the cool thing about this that happens is you start sharing it and other people show up with their own ideas, right? And with their own feedback. And suddenly you build that into your creative process. And so it's not just like, it actually works a lot better if you don't just like go off in a dark room and polish a thing and then put it out in the world and like expect people to see your genius. But if you, take the time to share the rough drafts, share the ideas, share what you're working on, what you'll find is that other people will come out of the woodwork and they'll have their own thoughts and ideas and things to contribute. They'll point you towards resources you didn't know about. They'll show up and help you build this. And that's a pretty magical experience.
It's like there's the famous software is eating the world. I feel like this is almost agile is eating the world. Like waterfall is dead, not only for project management, but with everything. It's just, you've just got to put it out there and let people beat it up or tell you why they wouldn't use it or whatever it is. And then see, the last question I had for you was going to be for advice for listeners, for people, whether they're, I don't know, let's say someone listening is 25, early in their career, sitting in a would-be corporate office job, probably working from home right now, and they want that freedom and independence. I was going to say, where would you steer them towards? Like, you've got all these Web3 opportunities, you've got creating content online, and you've got the sort of more technical chops, coding and the like. I feel like we sort of answered that a little bit, but I'll give you the last word. Just any advice for people who are listening to this and just want to have that kind of more independent online creator career?
I think the most important part is what we just talked about, being vulnerable, putting yourself out there, building in public. But there's more to it than that, right? I think it's about finding your little corner of the internet to hang out with. If you look at all of the most creative, productive people in history, they almost always were operating within an environment where they were surrounded by other creative people working on interesting stuff. And that sort of thing, whether it's like Florence or whether it's Los Alamos or wherever, you have to find that place for you. And now those places are online. And so I think it's about being willing to put yourself out there and be vulnerable, but to do it in a way where you're doing it as part of a community and where you're finding the other people who want to do and think about and talk about the same things as you. And if you can find those people and then you can be vulnerable with them, and you can dedicate yourselves collectively to the craft that you're working on, whatever it is, right? Whether that's joining a DAO and participating in building something, whether that's finding a community of programmers or podcasters or writers or whatever, right? It doesn't matter what, as long as it's something that you're really excited about and that you can find a community of other people that are really excited about and you can push each other. That's how you make the magic on the internet.
I love it. That's a perfect place to leave it. John, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you. This was a tremendously fun conversation. I really appreciate it.